It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1946, and Private Kenji Watanabe was standing at the edge of Windermere when he understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had never seen anything beautiful before. Not in the way that he was seeing it now. He had seen beauty in Japan, the cherry blossoms at Kyoto that his mother had described to him before he was old enough to travel, the mountain slopes of Nagano where his unit had trained in the winter of 1943, the specific quality of light on rice paddies in the early morning that every Japanese man of his generation carried somewhere in his memory as the visual definition of home. He had seen all of these things, but he was 23 years old, and he had spent the preceding 2 years in conditions that had systematically removed from his daily experience everything that was not the war, everything that was not the noise and the fear and the institutional totality of a military existence that had no category for the kind of still, unhurried attention to a lake and a sky and a line of hills that he was now, on a Tuesday morning in March, discovering he was capable of. The water was the color of pewter in the morning light. The hills above it were the specific green of a northern English spring, a green so saturated and so various that it defeated the single word used to describe it, containing within it dozens of shades that shifted as the clouds moved across the sky above them. A farm was visible on the far shore, its whitewashed walls bright against the hillside, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin vertical line that the stillness of the morning air allowed to climb without dispersing. And there was silence, not the silence of concealment or of tactical waiting or of men controlling their breathing in positions under fire, but the silence of a place that had simply never been loud, that had been doing what it was doing now for centuries before the war, and would continue doing it for centuries after, indifferent to everything that human beings were capable of doing to each other in the spaces between. Kenji Watanabe stood at the edge of Windermere for 20 minutes. He was supposed to be walking to the farm where he had been assigned to help with the spring planting. He was already late. He did not move. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. The program that had placed Kenji Watanabe at the edge of Windermere on that March morning was not, in its official designation, a program designed to show Japanese prisoners of war the English Lake District. It was a labor allocation scheme, a practical response to the specific agricultural crisis that post-war Britain faced in the winter of 1945 and 1946, when the demobilization of the British military was removing from the agricultural workforce the labor that wartime deployment had replaced with German and Italian prisoners, and when the farms of the Lake District and the surrounding regions were facing the spring planting season with insufficient hands to work the land. Japanese prisoners held in British custody, the men who had surrendered in Burma, in Malaya, in Singapore, in the various theaters where British forces had accepted the capitulation of Imperial Japanese units, were available. The farms needed workers. The administrative logic was straightforward. The men who implemented this logic had not, for the most part, thought carefully about what it would mean to place men who had spent years in the institutional totality of the Imperial Japanese military inside the specific landscape of the English Lake District. They had thought about labor hours and agricultural output and the administrative mechanisms for transporting and supervising prisoner labor, because these were the categories that the labor allocation scheme's administrative framework provided. What happened inside the prisoners when the Lake District happened to them was not a category that the administrative framework had anticipated. What happened was this. The men found the place irresistible. The Lake District that the Japanese prisoners encountered in the winter and spring of 1946 was, by the accident of its geography and its climate and its particular quality of light, one of the most visually compelling landscapes in Europe, a landscape that had produced, through the preceding century, a tradition of English poetry and painting and philosophical reflection on the relationship between the human spirit and the natural world that the Japanese prisoners did not know about and did not need to know about, because the landscape made its own argument without any assistance from Wordsworth or Coleridge or the romantic tradition that the hills and the lakes had inspired. The argument was simple. The place was beautiful, and the men encountering it had been a very long time away from beauty. The Japanese military culture that had formed these men had not been indifferent to natural beauty. Japanese aesthetic tradition, the centuries-old appreciation of landscape, of seasonal change, of the specific quality of light at particular times of day and particular times of year that had produced the haiku and the woodblock print and the garden and the tea ceremony, was as deeply embedded in the cultural formation of the men who had served the imperial military as any other element of what it meant to be Japanese. They had not been formed in an aesthetic vacuum. They had been formed in a culture that had developed, over centuries, an extraordinarily refined sensitivity to exactly the kind of visual experience that Windermere and Rydalwater and the slopes of the Langdale Pikes were providing them with. What the war had done was not eliminate this sensitivity, but suspend it, cover it with the operational demands and the institutional totality and the specific psychological weight of military service in conditions of sustained danger, until the sensitivity had been pushed so far below the surface of daily consciousness that the men carrying it had ceased to be aware that they were carrying it. The Lake District uncovered it, not gradually, not through any deliberate process of exposure and reflection, but immediately and with the specific force of a landscape that does not ask for your preparation before it makes its impression. The prisoners who were transported to the farms and the forestry operations and the maintenance work that the labor scheme provided found themselves, in the hours between their assigned tasks, in the presence of a landscape that was making continuous, insistent, entirely non-institutional claims on their attention. The hills were there. The light was there. The water was there. They had no operational significance. They required nothing from the men looking at them. They were simply what they were, with the absolute indifference of things that exist independently of the human framework assigned to interpret them. The British farmers and landowners who employed the Japanese prisoner labor documented their experiences in letters and diaries and the occasional local newspaper. Account that regional historians have assembled into a fragmentary but revealing picture of what the labor scheme produced in human terms. The accounts share a consistent quality of surprise, not at the prisoners' willingness to work, which was generally documented as genuine and often as exceptional, but at what the prisoners were like when they were not working. The men who spent their assigned hours doing what the labor scheme required spent their unassigned hours doing something that the farmers had not expected and that the administrative framework of the labor scheme had not anticipated. They were looking at everything with an attentiveness that the farmers, accustomed to their own landscape with the comfortable indifference of people who have always lived inside it, found both remarkable and slightly difficult to account for. A farmer named William Hartley, whose family had worked land on the eastern shore of Coniston water since the 18th century, described in a letter to his daughter, who had moved to Manchester before the war and who received her father's letters with the indulgent attention of someone who loved the man more than she loved the Lake District. A Japanese prisoner named Hiroshi who had been assigned to help with the dry stone wall repairs that the winter had made necessary. Hartley described Hiroshi as a good worker, patient with the specific skill of dry stone walling that required an intuitive understanding of how irregular stones could be fitted together into a stable structure, and as someone who had picked up enough English in the weeks of his assignment to communicate adequately for the work's practical requirements. What Hartley found harder to describe was what Hiroshi did during the lunch breaks that the work schedule provided, how he would sit on the wall he was repairing and look at the lake below with the specific quality of attention that Hartley associated in his limited aesthetic vocabulary with the way his wife looked at things she was trying to remember. Hiroshi was trying to remember. He had understood, with a clarity that the preceding months of captivity and repatriation uncertainty had sharpened rather than dulled, that what he was looking at was not going to be available to him for much longer, that the administrative processes of the occupation and the repatriation program would eventually resolve his situation in a direction that took him away from Coniston water and back to a Japan whose condition in 1946 he knew about only from the filtered accounts that the camp's information channels provided. He was looking at the lake the way a person looks at something they know they're going to lose, with the specific intensity of attention that the knowledge of loss produces in that ordinary possession. The comfortable inattention of the person who assumes the thing will always be there does not. The repatriation question was, for the Japanese prisoners in the Lake District, not a simple one. The official position of the British administration was that repatriation would occur as logistics permitted, that the prisoners would be returned to Japan when the shipping and the administrative arrangements made it possible, and that the timeline was a matter of practical organization rather than political decision. The unofficial reality was that the timeline was extended repeatedly and for multiple reasons, in ways that kept men in the Lake District for months longer than the initial program had projected. Some of those reasons were logistical. Some were the result of the administrative complexity of processing large numbers of prisoners through repatriation channels that had not been designed for the volume they were now handling. And some were the result of a specific and documented phenomenon that the British administrators found both unexpected and professionally awkward to address. The phenomenon of prisoners who did not, when asked about repatriation, express the urgency of return that the administrative assumption had predicted. The accounts of what the prisoners said when the repatriation question was raised directly, in the administrative interviews that the British prisoner processing system required, in the conversations that camp administrators had with individual prisoners over the months of the labor schemes operation, describe a pattern that the administrative framework had no category for. The men did not say they did not want to go home. They were not, for the most part, willing to make a statement that categorical about a situation whose emotional complexity resisted reduction to a simple preference. What they said, in various formulations and with varying degrees of directness, was something more specific and more revealing, something about the Lake District itself, about the specific quality of the experience it had provided, about the difficulty of describing what the hills and the water had done to them in the months of the labor schemes operation, and about the uncertainty they felt when they tried to imagine encountering, in the Japan of 1946, anything that would replace it. The Japan they were being repatriated to was not the Japan they had left. The reports that reached the prisoners through the camp's information channels described a country whose cities had been burned, whose infrastructure had been destroyed, whose people were managing the specific deprivation of a defeated nation in the immediate aftermath of a war whose destruction had been comprehensive in a way that no previous Japanese experience of war had prepared them to understand. The Lake District they were living in was not the Lake District of peacetime England either. It was an England of rationing and reconstruction and the specific austerity of a victorious nation paying the cost of its victory in the material reductions that the war had imposed and that the peace was inheriting. But the Lake District hills were still the Lake District hills. Windermere was still Windermere. The dry stone walls that Hiroshi had helped repair on the eastern shore of Coniston water were still there, holding the boundary between the farm and the fell with the patient stability of structures that had been doing the same thing since the 18th century. The food that the British farmers provided to the prisoner laborers working on their land was not, by any objective measure, exceptional. It was farm food, the practical, adequate provisioning of working men by people who understood that work required fuel and who provided it with the matter-of-fact generosity of a rural culture that had always organized hospitality around the table. For men who had spent the preceding years in the logistical conditions of the Imperial Army's Pacific campaigns, conditions in which adequate provisioning had become an increasingly theoretical concept as the supply chains that sustained the campaigns collapsed under American interdiction, the farm food's adequacy was itself significant. But what the prisoners documented as significant was not the food's nutritional content or its comparative generosity relative to what the camps provided. It was the manner of its provision, the specific social texture of being fed at a farmer's table, in a farm kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and cooked vegetables, and the specific domestic warmth of a house that had been lived in for generations, by people who were feeding them not because a regulation required it, but because a working man needed to eat, and this was simply what you did. Corporal Takeshi Miyamoto, who worked on William Hartley's farm for 7 months in 1946 and who documented his experience in a memoir published in Japan in 1978, described the farm kitchen at Coniston in terms that occupied more pages of his account than any of the battles he had participated in. He described the specific pattern of the oilcloth on the table, the weight of the pottery mugs that Hartley's wife used for the tea that appeared at mid-morning and mid-afternoon with a regularity that had seemed in the first weeks, almost ceremonially significant, and that he had eventually understood was simply what happened. That tea appeared because it was mid-morning or mid-afternoon, and that was when tea appeared, without ceremony or calculation, because the household had been doing it that way for decades and would continue doing it after Miyamoto had gone. He described the way Hartley talked while they worked, not at Miyamoto, but alongside him, in the manner of a man thinking aloud in the presence of another man he had decided was worth thinking alongside, using words that Miyamoto understood imperfectly, but whose tone communicated the essential information. He described the hills above the farm in conditions of different weather and different light. In the morning fog, in the afternoon sun, in the specific quality of an English autumn evening when the fells turned gold and the lake below them went dark and still. He did not describe these things as a man describing somewhere he had been. He described them as a man describing somewhere he had not left. The repatriation that eventually came, in late 1946 for most of the Lake District prisoners, extending into 1947 for those whose situations the administrative process had complicated, was documented in the British records and in the prisoners' own accounts with a consistency that the administrative assumption of universal eagerness to return had not predicted. The prisoners went. They went because going was what the situation required, because the administrative processes of the occupation and the repatriation program had resolved in a direction that did not provide for an alternative, because Japan was where their families were and where their lives before the war had existed and where whatever came next would need to be lived. They went, and several of them, a documented but not precisely quantified number whose accounts surface in the post-war Japanese memoir literature with a frequency that suggests the experience was widely shared even when it was not widely recorded. Described the departure from the Lake District with the emotional register that Miyamoto's memoir established as the template, as leaving somewhere that had become, in 7 months of dry stone walls and farm kitchens and Tuesday mornings at the edge of Windermere, not a place they had been sent to work, but a place they had, without planning or permission, come to love. Kenji Watanabe was repatriated in November 1946. He returned to Osaka, married in 1948, worked for a manufacturing company for 30 years, and raised 3 children in a city that the war had burned and that the peace had rebuilt into something that resembled, but did not replicate what had been there before. He did not return to the Lake District. The circumstances of post-war Japanese life, the economic reconstruction, the family obligations, the practical constraints of a life organized around recovery rather than reflection, did not provide for the kind of return that the experience had left him capable of wanting. But in the winter of 1989, when he was 66 years old, his eldest daughter found him at the kitchen table looking at a photograph that she did not recognize. A photograph of a lake she did not know, beneath hills whose green she had not seen, with the whitewashed walls of a farm visible on the far shore and a thin vertical line of smoke rising from its chimney into a still March morning. She asked him where it was. He told her it was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. And then he told her the story of the Tuesday morning in March of 1946, when he had stood at the edge of it for 20 minutes and understood, for the first time, what the word beauty actually meant. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. Kenji Watanabe and the men who stood at the edge of Windermere and forgot for a moment everything the war had made them, they deserve to be remembered. We found them.